Okay, so this is looking at RO91 of the iMedia course, specifically the second task, LO2, and essentially this is the planning section. Okay, now up here at the very top of the page, we have the actual brief, I suppose, and they're asking you to come up with a proposal for a teenage life simulation game that uses virtual reality. Okay, now one of the first things that you're going to need to do is write your own version of that brief. In the Zigzag guide, they have some great tips on doing it. They talk about how you can sort of pick out bits that are going to be, excuse me, that are going to be important and they're going to be significant. As far as the mark scheme goes, they ask you for a couple of things. Okay, I'm going to look at this middle band because it's sort of like popular plus. If you're adding a bit more detail, then you're going to be up here, and a little less, you're going to be down here. But everybody should be aiming really for this section as an absolute minimum. Essentially, they are saying produces an interpretation from the client's brief and picks out requirements for a digital game concept, okay, which meets most of the requirements. Now, in terms of a requirement, in the brief, there are only a few things they are asking you. There are only a few things you actually have to do. Okay, it says your task is to develop and write a proposal for a teenage life simulation game, right? So they want a proposal for a teenage life simulation game. That is a requirement. Okay, it has to use virtual reality. That has got to be in there somewhere. Okay, the target audience, so it has to appeal to teenagers aged 14 to 16 years old. Okay, after that, they talk about the fact that it could focus on some of or all of the following areas. Now, I think, honestly, you would be foolish to leave all of them out, but it does say could. Okay, so if none of these really fit your idea, I suppose it's plausible that you would leave them out, but I think you would be very, very foolish not to try and include some of them. Okay, after that, it says should. Okay, now should is also, I suppose, optional, but I think it is a bit more definitive. You really should be including these things. So once you've got your basic brief and you've said, I've got to do this, I've got to do this, I've got to do this, then you want to start to build a little bit more detail into this. Okay, this is fundamentally going to be a report. Okay, so you want to talk about where that game is going to be set. Okay, now that game could be set in Plymouth. It could be set in a world from a movie that you know, or it could be something that is totally made up. Where it is set is not important, but you do need to be a bit specific about it, right? Where is it set? What is that place like? Is it a totally different planet which has got totally different physics? Up is down, down is up, or is it just a planet which is all covered in trees? It is completely up to you, but you need to be specific about it. Okay. Next thing they say you should consider is essentially who is in it. Who are the characters, right? Are these going to be people? Are they going to be aliens? Is it going to be something totally random? Is it going to be shapes that you're controlling on the screen? Again, doesn't matter, but you do need to be a bit specific about who the characters are. Okay. I would also say that at some point you're probably going to need to design these characters, so bear that in mind. Don't describe something that you're really going to struggle to make. Okay. Equally, don't just say everything is a colored circle. That isn't very interesting. Next, it says what will the player do within the game. This is essentially what are the objectives within the game. Whoops, not highlighting the right bit there. This is essentially what are the objectives, right? If it is a game a little bit more like something like The Sims or SimCity, and there is no definitive end to that game, that is fine. But people do like playing those games. There is something in those games that keeps them interested. What is it? And that's what needs to come across here. Likewise, if this is a simulation game which is more similar to something like Assassin's Creed, whereby there are levels and achievements and things that you can do along the way, then you need to make sure that is clear. Okay, so essentially we need to lay down what the player or players are going to do inside of that game. Okay, and the last point here talks about how virtual reality could be used as part of the game. Now, when it's talking about virtual reality, that could be augmented reality. It could be that you are proposing a game that you play on a console but has some sort of like camera based phone app, which you can use to help you score points when you're sort of out and about in the real world. Equally, it could be something that requires specialist equipment. You could maybe need an HTC Vive or something in order to really get the proper game experience. Okay. Now, down the bottom, there are these other 4 bullet points. It says you have positive and constructive view of teenage life. Now, I know this isn't necessarily very cool, but it is something that you've got to include. So the game concepts and proposal should have a positive and constructive view of teenage life. So you could take a negative view of this. You could take the view that you're going to show all the bad things that could happen if you do bad things. Equally, you could do it the other way around. Okay, quite a good example of this, a game you may or may not have played, would be the Fable series. In those games, if you do bad things, your character gets all covered in scars. Whereas if you are a bit more positive and you're nice to people within the game, that doesn't happen. Now, I know that's quite a small thing, but that's something that maybe you could try and include within your game, some way of making it a positive influence on teenagers. You need to identify specifically who the intended target is. Okay, it says it needs to be aimed at teenagers aged 14 to 16, but is it going to be aimed at boys who really like football? Is it going to be aimed at girls who really like tennis? Is it going to be aimed at I don't know, teenagers who are interested in reading? You need to be specific about who you're actually targeting it at. Okay, and that is you. You need to come up with that. Okay, they've only said 14 to 16. That is all they've given you. Otherwise, you need to build that target audience. You need to identify the intended platform for the game. So, is this game for a phone? Is it for computer, like a desktop computer? Is it something that you're going to find in an arcade? Is it something that you're going to play on a console? Is it a combination? Right? Again, you need to be specific. And finally, it asks you for you to come up with some sort of narrative for your game, essentially some sort of story. Okay, now I suppose this could be quite rough. If it is going to be a game that's a little bit more like The Sims, then there is a pretty loose storyline in something like The Sims. There is probably umpteen ways that game can finish. However, something that is the opposite end of the spectrum, something like Assassin's Creed, has quite a definitive story, which actually in that instance plays out over the course of several games. So you're going to need to come up with some sort of narrative for that story, like what happens first, what happens in the middle, what happens at the end. Okay. Once you've done that, you've certainly finished the first part of LO2. There may be some other bits that we need to do as we move forward, but that will do for now. Hopefully that's been helpful. Hopefully that is something that you can use to help you with your work. Thank you very much for listening.